Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to FortneyScott's COVID-19 weekly briefing. These briefings are held every Monday and cover the latest topics and developments with regard to COVID-19 that impact the workplace. These briefings will be recorded. Everyone who registered today will be registered for all future briefings. These weekly briefings will continue as long as circumstances develop with regard to COVID-19. I want to address some preliminary items before we start today's briefing. Currently, all listeners' phone lines are muted. At any point in time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's weekly briefing is about what employers are doing in the workplace. The presenters include David Fortney and Nita Beecher from FortneyScott, Yolanda Hunter from Workplace HR, and a guest speaker, Sharon Fronneberger, who is the Head of Diversity and Inclusion, Global Accountability and Metrics at Johnson & Johnson. Welcome, Sharon. I will now turn the program over to David Fortney to start our weekly briefing.
Thanks so much, everyone, and we're really happy to have everyone with us today. As indicated, it's Monday, May 11th, so we're all continuing, obviously, working remotely and going through that. I know I speak for both Nita and Yolanda. We're really pleased to have Sharon with us today, a good friend, Sharon Fronneberger, and we'll introduce her more fully as we get into the program. First, let me take care of a few preliminary things so that our sponsors, which of course don't exist, but sponsors will be satisfied.
Wishful.
Yeah. No, but we, just a word about who we are. I think most of you know we are a woman-owned law firm. We are based in Washington, D.C., and our practice really focuses on the federal agencies that govern and regulate the workplace. Our attorneys and human resource consultants, as well as Sharon, co-presenting with us today, have significant experience in a wide range of workplace compliance matters involving all the agencies that we normally deal with. Now, just a moment about next slide on what we're doing today. Obviously, we're providing updated information, and although we're going to be discussing primarily legal developments, legal-based best practices, the purpose of today is not to provide you with legal advice. It is instead to make sure that you're up to date on these developments, and we would strongly encourage that each of you contact your respective corporate counsel or as appropriate outside counsel. We work with many of you. We enjoy that, but these are things I think all of us would agree are very legally driven, and so it's our privilege to be able to focus on those. All right, well, let's go over the agenda, and Yolanda, maybe you can kick that off for us.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. So as you all know and been following our weekly briefings, we have been diligently mining the fields as it relates to all of the updates and developments of COVID-19. So today we're going to continue in that effort as well. We're going to talk about the latest government actions, congressional actions, agency updates, and as we just indicated, we have Sharon Fronneberger from J&J, and we're going to get into a really good discussion with her about diversity and inclusion and their efforts. Then we'll have questions. Next slide.
Super. All right. Well, let me kick off the latest on government action. Like most weeks, there continue to be a number of developments. First and foremost, the federal government is actually itself, think of the federal government, remember, they're a rather large national employer, international employer for that matter, and they are beginning to reopen. The IRS has actually begun recalling people back to work. For most of us, the agencies that we interface with, the Labor Department, EEOC, the Labor Board, they continue to primarily be in a virtual posture. But Thursday evening of last week, OPM did issue guidance to each of the agencies saying, in essence, get ready, we're coming back in, we're going to be reopening. It does, however, tip to consistent with what local circumstances permit. So we do not envision that there will be just a big, at one moment the entire federal government will move from being remote to working on site again. That it will be incremental, and I think it will look a lot like our respective companies are doing, and they'll be struggling with local conditions and determining which operations and which employees come back. But the federal government, OPM, has issued that. The states, the action continues to be primarily at this point, certainly over the last week, at the state level. The states have, we've talked before in previous weeks about those patchworks. We've shown the maps. That continues to be the case. And some of the new twists, some of the states are, and these tend to be more of the red states, are looking at unemployment compensation. And they are looking to create incentives. That's a nice way of saying you will not get paid unless you go back to work. So increasingly, as employers struggle, and we're going to talk about this, individuals who may be susceptible to COVID circumstances and say, I don't want to go back, I'm not ill, I don't necessarily have an immediate reason, I just don't want to go back. If their employer is not able to accommodate that and they opt to stay home, a growing number of states are saying you may lose your eligibility for unemployment compensation. So the option of simply putting someone on unemployment comp and having them not working for a period, there's a growing trend that that's not going to occur. The debate as Congress sort of comes back, and I'm sure you've seen the videos, the House is scheduled to come back tomorrow. The Senate has come back, but the question of what the new funding bill is going to look like is going to be issue number one. The Senate is doing other business. Both houses are. The Senate is still trying to confirm judges and other nominees. But the primary number one agenda item continues to be new additional COVID funding legislative relief. One of the key issues continues to be whether there will be a safe harbor on a federal level for businesses, both employers, suppliers of tests and products, and a variety of other considerations as people come back. Once again, while that issue is being debated at the federal level, several states have already enacted a bit of a patchwork, a growing patchwork of varying safe harbors in states that are being put in place. So this is something that I think over the next 30 days we anticipate a lot of activity on that. All right, let's go to the next slide. Congress. I noted that the Senate is back. One thing to update those of you, many of you are federal contractors. People ask about Craig Lean, Director Craig Lean. What's his status? He's been nominated by the President to serve as the Inspector General. That is a Senate-confirmed position. Majority Leader McConnell has indicated that several inspectors general positions may be confirmed later this month. It is possible that Director Lean could be rolled up. I would anticipate that to be one of those voice call votes that people could do. It used to be as they were jumping on airplanes and leaving town, they would do those sometimes, but that isn't the operating mode now. But it's possible that Director Lean within the next 30 days may be in a new post, and then we would of course have a new person heading OFCCP. The additional issues I mentioned, the safe harbor already, the worker protections, the question of whether there will be additional protections by statute included in certain industries, whether there'll be additional funding, particularly for hospitals and healthcare professionals, as well as local law enforcement and other. This is what a lot of the state funding delves into those issues. Again, the political gulf is very significant on these issues at this point. So I hesitate to make a prediction, and I don't think we're going to see the funding in the next week. I think that this issue is going to take some time at the federal level to be sorted out. All right. Well, let's talk briefly, Nita, maybe you can talk about the EEOC, which has done its own kind of gymnastics move last week.
Exactly. So just a little bit of background. Back under the Obama era, there was a new component 2 which collected pay data. Long story short, the Trump administration put that in suspension. It got replaced back into requirement. Many employers had to do that this fall. And meanwhile, EEOC went to OMB and said, we're not going to do component 2 anymore. That data collection is over. But we do need renewal for component 1, which is the traditional EEO1 report. But the portal didn't open, So finally, this week, last week, EEOC said they're going to postpone collection of Component 1 data until next year. So you'll be collecting 2019 and 2020 data in March of 2021. The second big thing was something we mentioned last week, that EEOC had issued additional guidance about what employers could do with those employees who, as David was mentioning earlier, might be in vulnerable positions. And initially, they indicated employers could refuse to bring them back to work based on the direct threat to the employees. They withdrew that question last week and issued the proper legal correct answer, which is employers generally cannot exclude employees or take any adverse action solely because they have a disability that CDC identifies as potentially placing them at higher risk for severe illness. It cannot be allowed unless the disability poses a direct threat to their health and cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. So they have corrected that, and I think that was excellent on their part, and they made it very clear what employers can and cannot do. That still leaves employers between a rock and a hard place, but that they'll have to deal with on a case-by-case basis. So David, you want to take us out?
Sure. We'll go to the Department of Labor, and as we're doing that, I'll just point out that, folks, the new Q's and A's that EEOC issued, the site for that's on the slide, so take a look at those, because I think that's important that people fully understand that. All right, our friends at DOL, there's a lot of growing unhappiness from different quarters about whether OSHA is on the beat enough, whether they're really robustly enforcing and responding to whistleblower complaints. And this goes back, we've talked before about the general duty under Section 5A of the EEOC Act to provide a workplace free of known safety or health hazards, and the ability under Section 11C to file a complaint, what's called a whistleblower complaint. The growing concerns are OSHA isn't responding sufficiently. It's not investigating. It's not doing so quickly enough, as people are being forced to either work or potentially be let go from work, be fired. And if you're fired, of course, in most states you don't collect unemployment compensation. So it's an economic, very troubling economic issue for certain workers that face that dilemma. So in response to this, the Labor Department's Inspector General, which is the independent, that's the watchdog for the Labor Department, will be looking and bearing down on what OSHA is doing or not doing on those whistleblower complaints. Stay tuned. I will tell you, having been in an agency, it's never a good day in the office when the Inspector General says we're going to start reviewing what you're doing, because you can almost always second guess what people have done, but we'll see. Labor has also taken a couple of other points. One, the deadline for people seeking to convert their benefits if they have been let go from employment for COBRA. Normally there's a short period of time for doing that, 30 days. That has been extended. That's a good common sense to avoid a gotcha, so that people have more time to try to convert and not have a gap in benefits. Very important for that. Finally, we'll just report anecdotally, and it's beyond today's discussion, there continues to be a lot of confusion on administering the paid leave benefits, both paid sick, paid family leave. We see it with our own clients. How do you count to 500? That sounds like a simple question. The answer is it depends on when. You have to do it every time that someone asks, and a host of kind of, I'll call it gotcha type issues that people are just confused about. And part of this is Congress wrote this law quickly. To be blunt, it's not a well-written law. It's a well-intended law, but it's not necessarily well-written. The Labor Department largely has to enforce the statute as Congress gave it to it. So everyone's sort of stuck with that paradigm and working through that. But there continue to be some issues, and we're seeing that as kind of a hot spot. Well,
David,
Nita,
right before we go to Sharon, did you want to mention that Scalia, Secretary of Labor Scalia, is going to be in the middle, or they want to put him in the middle of the next round of stimulus, or whatever it is they want to call it, I think he's going to be put on the hot seat by both the Senate and the House here pretty quickly.
Correct. And both sides are sort of jockeying. I mean, it's an election year, so that isn't
Correct.
totally missing from the equation. But there continues to be a lot of unhappiness with should Secretary Scalia do an emergency regulation. Recall, we've talked about this. There's only the general duty clause with guidance that OSHA has issued. Should there be a regulation that would have greater enforcement teeth to it? Are the inspections being done in too light a manner, trying to work virtually? The Labor Department's workers themselves have to be concerned about their health and safety, so they're trying to monitor thousands of workplaces across the U.S. virtually. Are the state plans? There are 28 states that have their own state plans. Are they being held sufficiently accountable by the federal government that's supposed to monitor and make sure they're effective? Those are open issues, and there is a growing sense that more heat, political heat, should be put on Secretary Scalia. So we'll see. I don't think you're going to see him making a lot of movement in response to that, but we'll see on that. All right. So those we think there's going to be more of those developments. Everything we've ticked off here in the next week or two. But one of the challenges, and I want to just briefly introduce our special guest today, Sharon Frauenbarger. And Sharon is with Johnson & Johnson. And one of the challenges that we have seen, and there's Sharon's full bio, which even with fine print, we still had to cut 2/3 of it off. Sorry, Sharon, we could only fit so much on the slide. But Sharon's not a newbie. And I will tell you that her heart and head are all in on D&I. And we've had the privilege of working a lot with Sharon on a lot of different issues. But one of the reasons we are so delighted to have Sharon join us today is that we're seeing with a lot of the clients we work with, the question of, wow, in this pandemic, I've got people working virtually, I've got some people coming back, some people that maybe are not coming back. What does my diversity program look like? Many of these are federal contractors, so affirmative action is an obligation. It isn't just a luxury item. It remains an obligation. And so folks in belt-tightening times, there's a lot of clients, it seems to be the current euphemism, how effective D&I programs can continue and in some cases change and flourish. And so I'm really excited, and I'm going to ask Yolanda and Nita to kind of have a little dialogue with Sharon. And I think that there's a lot of great lessons from what Sharon's been doing with Johnson & Johnson. So Sharon, I just want to tell you thank you again for joining us, albeit virtually. We're really glad to have you.
Well, thank you. I'm excited for today.
Good.
So let's go to the next slide, because Sharon, I'd like you to talk. J&J has a very unusual document, which I think is really the heart of all the things that you all do in D&I at Johnson & Johnson. Could you talk a little bit about its credo, right?
Yep. So absolutely, and thank you. So, a lot of I'm fortunate to work for a company where, not only are we the world's largest and most broadly based healthcare company in the world, but we also are guided by this document. It was written in 1943, so over 75 years ago, and I always like to point out, especially when we're talking to OFCCP, that it was written prior to a lot of the current legislation and executive orders. But this is a document that was written really to help us internally guide our decision-making process, because it takes into account all of our different stakeholders. And it was deliberately written in order so that we could think about first our patients, our doctors, our nurses, parents, the supply chain. So our external, a lot of times we think of them as our customers, then going to our employees, finally to communities, access to care, sustainability. And if we really focus our energies on those first three buckets, then we'll see a return to our shareholders. So, it was a very deliberate document to really outline how important all of our stakeholders are, and really, whenever we're making decisions, we think about the credo. I know David's probably heard me talk about it more than he even wants to, but it does come up in nearly every conversation that we have.
Well, I think it's a grounding document, and I think that's important. So let's take the next step, Yolanda. Let's go to the next slide, and do you want to talk a little bit with Sharon about what this pandemic has meant to J&J as far as what they're doing to try to overcome it?
Absolutely. So Sharon, can you give us a little bit about how you have responded with regards to the pandemic? Everyone is in a frenzy trying to figure all of this out as it relates to their organizations, as it relates to reopening, as it relates to their businesses and moving forward. But J&J seems to have a really good, some great efforts out there as to what you're doing as it relates to the vaccine efforts, community efforts. Can you talk to us a little bit about all of what you're doing in those areas?
Sure, absolutely. And I kind of organized this in terms of our credo, because it's just, it's naturally for us to approach things in such a way. But, and these are all actual articles that you could find out on the internet. But one thing that we've done is in supporting our frontline healthcare workers and communities, right? So we believe that because we do have a responsibility to the communities, to our customers, and we also have a very large operational scale and financial strength in the world, that we can help support our frontline health workers, which, by the way, we were doing before COVID-19 happened. We had pledged to help support our nurses and other healthcare workers with a pledge of about $250,000 prior to COVID-19. We've since added additional money to that, as well as made sure that we were, focused on getting PPE to those communities. We also happen to have many of our key U.S. locations are in this, hotspot of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. So, a lot of our efforts are really focused in those particular areas. So really making sure that, the people that are ultimately helping to support us are, us as individuals are being taken care of. Then we ratcheted up to, hopefully you saw this week, yesterday on the Sunday news channels, where Dr. Paul Stoffels was talking about our vaccine research and how, although we do hope that this passes without a vaccine, that we don't believe that it actually will. And so we've really been putting a lot of research and financial efforts behind creating a vaccine. And just to think about, typically a vaccine takes somewhere between 5 to 7 years to create.
Wow. Yeah.
Right. And so, and we don't have that kind of time. I know I don't think I'm going to survive a quarantine for 5 more years. But
I don't think anyone can.
But we have committed to focusing our efforts. So we do have a lot of people still, working in our research labs to research different treatments, as well as kind of identify those therapies that could be used to address COVID-19. Dr. Paul Stoffels, as well as Alex Gorski, our CEO, have publicly committed to us creating over a billion doses of a vaccine by next year, which is
incredible.
Yeah.
That's very exciting. Anything else that you are, you guys are doing a ton of stuff, but it looks like you're also working on devices as well, ventilators and that type of thing?
So also working on devices. So when this first broke, we saw a lot in the news around how there was a ventilator shortage in many of our hospitals. So we worked with another organization and created it's a device, and I'm sorry I don't recall the name of it, but it basically allows you to use one ventilator for two people. So it basically splits it in half. So effectively doubling the number of ventilators that a hospital would have. So definitely trying to think through all of the different aspects of how we have our diversified portfolio. We have our consumer business, so making sure that we're continuing to get our consumer goods out to patients, whether it be Tylenol or Pepcid or any of our other products. Medical devices focused on the ventilators, and then also from pharmaceuticals, creating this vaccine. And I think one other notable thing about the vaccine is we're creating this at risk. So we're going to manufacture 1 billion doses of this product even before we know whether or not the FDA is going to approve.
Wow, that's amazing.
Right? Yeah.
It's amazing. It really is.
Yeah, it shows dedication. My goodness.
One thing, and not everyone necessarily has the resources and abilities to respond in such a direct frontline manner, and we're all very fortunate that Johnson & Johnson has responded and stepped up in the manner it has. But many of you out there, as you hear this, think about the ways that your organization is stepping out and making a difference to the impact on your workers, their families. Because I, from what I see, clients of all different sorts are all doing things. And I think that what Johnson & Johnson, beyond doing a great job, as Sharon has described, they also do a good job in communicating to their team members and other key stakeholders what they're doing, how they're doing, why they're doing it, so that people really appreciate and understand. And I will say, that it creates, I know, among the Johnson & Johnson team, a result is people say, I'm really glad I work for J&J.
Right.
It's like I'm on their team, we're on the right team, and this is a really significant point. So it's not just doing the right thing, but it's sharing with people what you're doing, how you're doing. And I think that yields a lot of loyalty and positive impact that will hopefully, I think, far outlive the four corners of this crisis.
Sharon, there's one other thing this raises too. If we go to the next slide, obviously, as you were talking, you have had employees in the workplace all of this time. Would you like to talk a little bit about what you all are experiencing as far as having people in the workplace? Do you have people working remotely and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a bit of a mix. So, our total workforce is about 140,000 employees globally. We're in 60 different countries, and as we've seen in the news, different countries are experiencing COVID-19 at different times at different levels. We do have actually a pretty big plant in China. So from the very beginning, we were really tracking this from how is this going to impact our employees' perspective, and then have continued to grow that as we've seen this happen, more globally. And number one, as is mentioned in our credo, is really protecting the health and safety of our employees, and that's regardless of where they are. So we do have something like about 20%, maybe a little bit less, of employees that are still going to the workplace, even as we speak today. And these folks are really dedicated to the research aspect. So research is one of those jobs that's really tough to do, at your home, in your home office. And then also the manufacturing and the supply side,
right?
Because again, you need to be on the manufacturing line in order to make that happen. Right. So taking those groups of employees into account, it's about making sure that they are safe in their workplaces, that there's appropriate PPE for them, and that they are going through the the disinfecting protocols before they leave the office, both when they enter and when they leave, so that they're not taking any back, to their families. We would hate that to happen. So that's kind of one aspect is making sure that our employees that are continuing to go to work are safe. We've recognized them with a additional payment to basically thank them for going in during these times. And then on the flip side, we have the other group of employees, which I'm part of, where we're able to work from home. We're able to work remotely, as long as have computer will work, basically. And
we know that story, let me tell you.
Right? I can see everybody's background is a little bit different than our typical office conference rooms. So in making sure that we have the infrastructure in place so that people can effectively work from home. I mean, I don't know what you guys were thinking when this all started, but I know when I came home, like, wow, is the internet going to hold up to all of us being on at the same time?
I think that was a real question, honestly, because, it's a lot of people, because I notice I work from home all the time, and I notice that at certain times during the day, even when not everybody's working from home, it'll slow down. So, yeah.
So, that was definitely like our IT folks making sure that they're focused on not real technical, but the appropriate bandwidth to make sure that everything can continue to work. Making sure that we all feel comfortable, because it's not our regular, I usually work from home every Friday. It's not my regular work from home Friday.
Not the regular,
right?
No,
I mean,
it's not the regular.
Additional people are here in my house. My partner is, homeschooling her son, and normally, nobody else is here. It's me. It's my catch-up day. It's fantastic. But it's definitely a different environment that we're all working in. So knowing that different people are experiencing different things, they might be the primary caregiver. I would imagine it's very hard to homeschool and work at the same time.
Very.
So we've offered additional leave to those employees so that they can, focus on what's important. I mean, family is very important at this time, and the work will get done. So
exactly. And Sharon, during those times, what we have talked about previously and with some of our clients is the importance of wellness and being mindful and pushing out the importance of utilizing your EAP programs. And even sometimes setting up your Zoom calls, instead of having a business agenda, have a fun agenda to talk about something fun, just to get them relaxed a little bit, because it is, to your point, and what we've talked about several times with our clients, is it is frustrating at times because they have so much going on. Their kitchen is now their office, along with everyone else utilizes the kitchen for various things. So, I mean, you hit it right on the head, because that's what we've talked about, and it's definitely important. That employee wellness is centered and key for the success for people to try to get through this time period.
Sharon, you mentioned, in fact, that you all had sort of a fun thing to try to boost everybody's morale on one of your calls. You mentioned to us.
Yeah, and what I love about this is really anybody can do it, right? So we have a weekly Zoom call with the entire team. It's optional, it's earlier in the morning, just to kind of kick things off on a Thursday and check in. But we have little contests. So last week it was, because in Zoom you can change your background. It doesn't have to be your office space. So last week it was your favorite athlete. So we all had pictures of our favorite athletes. And at J&J, our D&I team is not that big. It's about 15 people. And the number of similar athletes we all chose was quite, I thought, remarkable. So that was interesting. The week before, we had done favorite sitcom, favorite pre-1990s sitcom.
Now, is that That's hilarious.
Oh my gosh, that's great.
So let me just circle back just for a minute, and then we're going to move on to the D&I here in a minute. But what are you doing with employees that either don't work in the workplace, they aren't working at their workplace, or they can't work from home? How are they being handled by J&J? Recognizing, it's a very large company, but just to give everybody an idea of what a large company is doing.
So we've offered them additional leave so that they can, they still keep their benefits, still keep getting paid, but they're on a leave status until we can really address what that next phase of work is going to be. Similar to our government and many of the state governments, we have a kind of 3, maybe 4 phase rollout plan of how we're going to be, returning to the workplace. There's a lot of stage gates that have to be reached in order to get there. But, as with pharmaceuticals as one of our main businesses, as you might imagine, a lot of our folks are salespeople, and they are going out and visiting the different hospitals. And, you can't visit a hospital right now unless you yourself are injured or sick. So, all those people have to be reallocated to do different things or be placed on leave. But we are in a fortunate position where we can, have job security for folks.
And so, Sharon,
one last thing before.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Yolanda.
How is this also affecting how is this also affecting your recruitment efforts? Because some organizations, they just can't bring people back at all, but there is a need, or they have to restructure how their business is being done based upon the results of the pandemic. So how is this affecting how you guys look at your recruiting right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, fortunately for us, we had been doing a lot of virtual recruiting prior to COVID-19.
Oh, wow, cool.
So from an interview perspective, we kind of had the infrastructure was already set up. So that was very positive. Secondly, we have refocused our efforts to make sure that from an external perspective, we're only hiring people in prioritized areas right now. So folks, really dedicated to the COVID-19 situation, because we feel that that's most critical to make sure that we're having the best and the brightest really focused on the situation. And we'll see what happens as things continue to roll out. But we have continued recruiting and bringing people in. It's just been a lot more focused, and of course 100% virtual.
Yeah.
One last thing before we move on to D&I, which is the other focus we wanted to talk about today, is I know you all have had a really great internal support for those who want to give back. Have you all done anything in particular during this time to support your employees who want to do that?
Yeah, so we have, this is really the third paragraph in our credo. So again, very important to us. And so we've continued to match our employees' giving efforts. So if they want to have a monetary donation to organizations, we are continuing to match that. And in addition, I was actually super excited. I typically do a week of volunteer time every year. It's paid for by the company. Last year I went to Vietnam and taught English. It was super exciting, and we had planned to do something else this summer, but unfortunately we weren't able to do it because of travel. But our organization has really reached out and figured out all of these volunteer virtual activities that we can continue to do. And whether it is helping support the telephone lines at the Trevor Project, or continuing to help with some other organizations where we're basically just using our job skills to help nonprofits advance their work. That's different things that we're able to continue doing. So I'm happy to say that is still continuing.
Super. So Yolanda, let's go to the next slide. And did you want to talk a little bit with Sharon about her baby, this wonderful project?
Yes, absolutely. So Sharon, coming from the HR world, I completely understand the importance of diversity and inclusion. It's always at the forefront when we're doing a lot of our practices. And with the organizations and federal contractors that we work with, we're working with them in going beyond the box. Most organizations want to just go down the checkbox of diversity and inclusion, not understanding how it goes across, not down the organization, how it goes externally, how it has to be conveyed in your policies. And back to the credo, J&J has seemed to master that. And then with the most recent release of You Belong, the Diversity and Inclusion Impact Review, can you talk about your D&I efforts?
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, this was definitely my baby, working on it for some time. And I think that the key around this is, and what I love about our approach to diversity and inclusion is our approach is not to have D&I as a program or an initiative or something that is a kind of standalone or an add-on to the organization, but we've actually embedded D&I as a business imperative. So so that it's not just something that lives within HR. It's not an overall philosophy or anything. It is truly embedded in how we work and what we do, and that's a lot of what the You Belong really outlines is our journey. So about 5 years ago, our new Chief Diversity Officer, well, she's not new, but 5 years ago, Wanda Bryant Hope took over the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And I was fortunate to be part of the D&I team at that time. And what we did is we took a step back and said, hey, you know what? We really need to approach diversity and inclusion as a business challenge, not as an HR challenge, but really how do we make sure that it is part of what everybody is thinking about when they're making a decision? How is D&I, brought into that and really embedded into, I guess, basically our DNA at Johnson & Johnson, and that's really what the report review, really outlines.
Well, it's really good to, I just wanted to mention, one of the things I've seen over the years, because I've been on the in and out of D&I for the last, I hate to say how long, 30 years maybe. And one of the things that I think you just made the point, and I think something that I believe is a best practice for all employers is D&I does need to be not a program. It needs to be something that everybody's committed to. Because I think we all have seen in those organizations where it's just a program, as soon as the new CEO comes in or the new diversity person comes in or the new whatever, that it goes away. And I think that what's really been interesting with what you all are doing, and we'll talk about that, Yolanda will talk about that with you in just a minute, is how with Johnson & Johnson it's been steady, and I do think that goes back to the credo. So what are the top 2 or 3 things that come out of your impact review that you think all employers should take away as far as best practices for D&I?
Well, I mean, I think that you were just talking about the number one is really to make sure that that D&I is embedded and not a program. I mean, I still remember a time, both at J&J and working for other organizations where, I would be involved in conversations where we would have succession planning and then we would have diverse succession planning.
Correct.
But that's not really connecting for me. Why are we not just, we're talking about everybody.
The same person would be put up for succession on every single slate, and you knew they weren't going to get any of those jobs. It's kind of like, I hate to say it, but what's going on in the NFL these days. But David, just saying, David, because it's his beloved Pittsburgh Steelers who tried to do the right thing. But so if that's number one, let's go, Yolanda, to the next slide. And because I think the commitment of Johnson & Johnson, and I think the commitment every employer should have to D&I is really outlined in your all's response from D&I to COVID-19.
Exactly. And before we deep dive a little into this, I think it's important that we've kind of touched upon a little bit when we're talking about, and I think we use the term the DNA, it has to be in the DNA of the organization. That's critical because I think what's important for organizations to understand is diversity and inclusion is not just staying in the box, checking the box, okay, we did it.
Mm-hmm.
It's about understanding what that means. It means fresh perspectives. It means new solutions. It means creativity. Right. It creates an entirely different perspective to your business, externally as well, dealing with your suppliers and others. And it also helps with also all of the recruiting efforts as well. And it aligns the business in a manner that allows it to be successful in a number of ways, opposed to just going down one track. So Sharon, let's look at this. I mean, because everything that I have seen with regards to J&J seems to have the blueprint back to 1943 with the credo. And we've worked with a lot of organizations that are big, small federal contractors, and we're working with them on getting the D&I right and how to incorporate it into their policies and go across the board. So let's talk a little bit, and this is a critical time in response to the pandemic, because operations are now trying to make fast decisions. And we know that's not always a good thing to do. And when you make those fast decisions, D&I is kind of pushed to the back burner, and we don't want that to happen. So let's talk about J&J's response directly to COVID-19.
Yeah, so I think this is an example of why it's so important to have it embedded into your business decisions, right? So we actually, when this started, we had a number of things that were happening that as an internal D&I department, we had decided that we were probably going to need to deprioritize them. And not because we thought they weren't important, talking about conscious inclusion and a lot of the other activities we were doing, but because our initial thinking was, well, maybe with everything happening, it's not going to be important to the organization, right? But then imagine as we started continuing to get calls of, hey, Sharon and team, what are we doing? Why am I not hearing from you? Are we not advancing D&I? And all of a sudden it kind of like clicked. We're like, wait, it truly is. Like, our leaders do believe that diversity and inclusion is a priority for our business, even in times like these. So it really allowed us to pivot and make sure that we were focused on the needs of our organization. So again, thinking about the credo elements, we of course wanted to think through our employees and how are we supporting our employees. So making sure that we're highlighting different resources and identifying links to employee belonging. We think about times of additional stress and how important resiliency is, how important psychological safety, and we know that all of those are components of employee belonging. So making sure that our leaders are focused on that, and then communicating. Everybody can over communicate, and I think that if there's any time in our history that over communication is important, it's now. Right? So not only communicating to the kind of needs, our basic needs that are happening, but also communicating about how inclusive leadership is important, because we have to take care of our employees. We have to do fun Zoom calls or send people pizzas or whatever it takes to to keep things light. But then it's also, how can we leverage our internal networks, our employee resource groups to help spread the word and help our communities during this time of disruption. And I think we've probably all seen on the news about the the healthcare disparities, which are nothing new. I mean, it's just becomes enhanced through a COVID-19 situation. So so making sure that we are continuing to think about that and then communicate internally and externally to our different communities. I think those are kind of the key, our key response plans.
Sharon, one of the things that I think is really important is because this pandemic has been so impactful on people of color, the fact that you all highlight that and remind, people that are doing this research, because what we don't know is what impact does a vaccine have on people of color versus white, for example, or as between African Americans and Hispanics, for example, and reminding people of those things. And I think now more than ever, sometimes diversity is, many of the organizations we've worked at, they back away because it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to have people who think differently. If there ever was a time to think differently, now is it. And so I think the reminder of how important D&I is from that perspective is really, really crucial. Yolanda?
Absolutely. I agree over 110%. And I think, Nita, to your point, not only do you have to think differently, but you also, I want to add, you want to also have a balance because it's all inclusive. You got to think differently to understand how you bring people in, but then you also have to create that feeling of inclusivity and how they feel inclusive and how your actions are also demonstrating that. And again, that goes across the board with your communications. Communication is the absolute key. We talk about it all the time with our clients, is the importance of communicating, how to be transparent, how to make sure your efforts are clear, what your expectations are. And it's all those things, Sharon, that you talked about that are critical with D&I and how it has to be a part of the business thought process. It starts with your leadership and how it goes across the organization.
I was just going to reinforce that. I think even small organizations, can take that away. If you have to have leader-driven D&I, because we've already talked about embedding, but it has to come from the top because that's just how organizations are. They respond to that. And the fact that your leaders recognize that is huge, I think, for the future of the company, and I think for D&I inside J&J. So any other particular, so are you using your supplier diversity as well during this time, Sharon? I know you have a very strong supplier diversity group as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for reminding me about that. Making sure that we are not only utilizing and thinking about our employees and our nurses, but utilizing our existing supply chain to, one, get the PPE and other necessary medical supplies to folks, whether it is us directly or us utilizing our supply chain to help others get items from point A to point B. And also, and very important, is making sure that we are sharing our communications with our suppliers so that they're well informed, doing things like accelerating cash payments. We know that different people are experiencing cash flow issues. So what can we do to really kind of help and also just identify, like, what is our essential business at this time, and let's help our efforts there.
Exactly.
So Yolanda, do you have one last question? Because we're getting towards the end, and then David or Yolanda, any additional questions for Sharon? I think what she has outlined is really top of the line, and I'm sure some people are going to look at it and go, pretty intimidating, but I think within this are the nuggets of how you get and keep your D&I program going, even during such, a once-in-a-lifetime situation as we have right now with COVID-19. Yep. There's many lessons to be learned, even for small organizations, right, David?
Exactly.
That's right. And one of the things that and I think Sharon's done a great job in helping us kind of understand that even while working remote and all of these other uncertainties, the D&I program doesn't get taken off the desk. It doesn't get taken off, taken off the budget. It doesn't get taken off of focus. Here we have, just using this as a case study, we see, even without prompting, but some organizations may need prompting, but we have the senior leadership team being mindful of it. We have it up and down, and that's because they started this situation with it being very woven in, as we've talked about. But even if it's not as tightly woven in, because not everyone is like this, it still is an opportunity as part of the communications that we've talked about, because you're communicating on a lot of things, but responding to employee values, what's being there, recognizing employee contributions, positive ways, whether it's volunteerism, other things, encouraging that. There's a lot of things that just in terms of dollars and cents doesn't take much. It can be learned from this case study, I think, for many employers, from small to very large, as kind of a best practice case study, which is why I think this is very, very helpful for that. Obviously, those of you that are federal contractors, a lot of this can bleed into addressing affirmative action. They're not co-equal. They are legally different and substantively different, but one can feed the other. And federal contractors do have additional obligations to keep in mind in terms of how they go about if they either are providing work opportunities and recall, depriving people of work opportunities, layoffs, furloughs, and potential terminations, which unfortunately for a number of folks is going to be part of the employment landscape that we have to talk about. But we've talked before about making sure, whether it's legally, making sure we do things to assess impact, to make sure there's not improper adverse impact to protected groups, to making sure that we're understanding what individual skills are and perceptions. I think one of the challenges many of our clients, their D&I programs, have been enhanced over the last 2 or 3 years where the economy was good and they were successful in adding a lot of new people and new skills, and their workforces became much more diverse in every sense of the word. If you do last in, first out, a lot of the gains over the last 2 or 3 years are going to get chopped. So maybe you look at an appropriately tailored skill assessment or other ways to keep that in mind if you do have to make those sorts of force reductions. So there are ways of, I think this helps inform so many corporate decisions, communications, and workforce decisions. I think, to me, that's the most important takeaway from this.
I think that's right, David. And I think one last thing is that what this also shows is all this work that D&I has done interweaves so closely with their legal obligations in the federal contractor that when both groups work together as one, you end up with a better product no matter what.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely.
So, Sharon, do you have any last words? We probably have a minute or two. David, did we get any questions? I guess I should ask.
Oh, I've cleared the question board. We're good on that. So go ahead. Yeah, Sharon, you got about 60 seconds. So a key thought that people should take with them.
Correct.
So I guess I would close just with an acknowledgement that you don't have to be a Johnson & Johnson to think about diversity and inclusion and embedding in your business, right? So so 2 things, like we're all going through the same event right now, but we're all going through it differently. And I think that's the key that we need to remember is just because you can work from home doesn't mean everybody in your organization can. It also doesn't mean everybody in your organization can work as effectively as you can from home. So just to kind of keep that in mind. And then, I'll just come back to the communication piece. I mean, communication's free. And, this is definitely the time we need to be, as far away as we are geographically and physically, we need to make sure that we're very close together in terms of communication. So
Absolutely.
Yeah. Super. David, you want to close us out here?
Well, I think those are I think exactly the right learning points. So with that, I will thank both Sharon, particularly. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it, and obviously keep up all the wonderful things that you and the J&J team are doing. We all stand to benefit from this in so many ways, but particularly the vaccine research, and we're counting on that. So, and I want to thank obviously Nita and Yolanda for an excellent session today. And Adriana, would you tell us please about next week?
Sure. We would like to thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, you may view the previous weekly briefings on our website at www.FortneyScott.com. Please join our next weekly briefing on Monday, May 18th, and be on the lookout for additional updates, which will be sent via email. All registrants from today have been registered for the future weekly briefings. If you have any questions that you would like to have addressed during the next weekly briefing, please submit them via email to info@FortneyScott.com. Thank you, and we hope to see you next week.
Terrific. Thank you all very much. And Sharon, thank you.
Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Be safe.